Everyone, welcome to Ethics for Lunch for February. This is our monthly forum sponsored by both the Ethics Committee here at the hospital and the Berman Institute of Bioethics, where we bring a topic of interest to the community and try to engage in some discussion. Great panel today, as always, and glad that you're here to participate in this conversation. So just to let you know, for purposes of attendance, on the handout, you have the text code that you should send in to CME. Even if you don't need the continuing education credits, it's just helpful for us for continued sponsorship of the sessions that you do record your attendance. So please do that. Without further ado, I will introduce Juli Bollinger, who will introduce our topic and the panel.
Thank you all. Thanks all for coming. We're really looking forward to hopefully having a really engaging discussion. I am Juli Bollinger. I'm a research associate and associate faculty at the Berman Institute here at Hopkins. I am a genetic counselor by training, but for the past 12 or 13 years now, I've been doing a lot of research in areas of examining ethical issues and challenges in integrating the ethics and genomic methodology into research and clinical care. And I am delighted to have two of my colleagues join me on this panel where we're going to discuss some of the ethical challenges that are associated with enroll families into genomic research, which has another complicating dimension to it. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over and have my colleagues introduce themselves.
Hello, my name is Deborah Matthews. I'm faculty in the Berman Institute of Bioethics. I'm a human geneticist by training, but all of my research now focuses on ethics and policy issues raised by emerging biotechnologies.
I am Cindy James. I am a genetic counselor and geneticist in the Department of Medicine. I have spent the better part of my career taking care of families and doing research on families with inherited cardiomyopathies. I also do research on genetic counseling outcomes and research to inform those of us who conduct genomics research how to best interact with the families we're enrolling. And I'm really excited to be here today. I also have a couple of disclosures I need to report. So in the part of me that does research on families with inherited heart disease, I receive salary support on Collins Investigator-Initiated Research Grant funded by Boston Scientific Corps. That's on what kind of implantable defibrillators work best in our ARVC patients. And I also received travel and hourly pay for a talk using my own slides at a Women in Electrophysiology educational seminar last year in Charleston, funded by Abbott Inc., and I'm glad to be here today.
All right, so as Julie said, we're going to talk about some of the issues that arise when you are enrolling families in research. And typically, in the US, historically, and for very good reasons, we've been very focused on the person in front of us, right? We've very focused on autonomy and individuals having the right to make decisions about what happens to them. But genetic research is inherently familial, right? This is not just your information, it's shared by your family members. Some proportion of it is shared by your family members. So often we have to enroll families in research to figure out what's going on with the person in front of us. And so that raises issues at the stage of enrollment, right? You need not just one person, but multiple people to enroll. And at the point of returning results, right? Because different people might make different decisions about what information they want back. And this raises all sorts of challenges for us in genetic research. And we're going to be focusing in our brief presentation on genetic research, but these issues are raised across contexts, so also in clinical care and certainly in the direct-to-consumer market, which I'll talk just a tiny bit about in a minute. So I'm going to start by giving you a brief primer on the importance of enrolling families and talk a bit about some of the ethical challenges raised when we're enrolling families in research. Then I'm going to turn it over to Cindy, who's going to talk about a couple of concrete examples of work that we're doing on a couple of projects here at Hopkins where we've encountered some of these issues firsthand. And then we're going to turn it over to Julie, who's going to walk us through the case study and moderate the discussion about that. So as I mentioned before, right, genetic information isn't just yours. You share it to certain degrees with your family members. So, and I can't tell you anything about the meaning of your genomic sequence without having access to other people's data and medical information. That's the only way I can make meaning out of what is in a genome. And that's true broadly across the population, and it's true in families oftentimes. So unless it is a gene that we know very much about and know exactly, well, insofar as we can, what the mutations do, we need members of your family to participate in research or in clinical care so that we can interpret the results that we find in you. It's important in pedigree analysis, so this is like your family tree, to sketch out how a particular disease or trait is traveling through your family, or what the age of onset is in your family, what the range of variability in that trait is in your family. Again, you need information from your family. In fact, the way I told my in-laws that I was pregnant the first time, that they were going to be grandparents, was I had the little baby book. And I just started asking them the family history questions. Right? That information is important for me as well as for the broader family. In family association studies, for identifying genes, again, if we don't know, if we haven't yet found a gene that causes the condition that's running in your family, we need people in your family who have the trait and people in your family who don't have the trait to contribute samples as well so that we can try to track that gene as it travels through the family. And in the interpretation of genetic test results, not just when we are at the stage where we haven't found the gene, but we can still track it through a family with markers. We need family members to participate. And at the level of sequencing, we're now doing a whole lot of sequencing, but different variants may cause disease on one genetic background or in one family, but not cause disease on another genetic background or in another family, or cause a slightly different version. So again, in all of these cases, it's important not just to have the person in front of us, but to have members of their family involved as well. But of course, this raises issues, because again, in this country, we're very focused, some people say, on the fingers instead of the hand, right? Whereas in other countries, there's more focus on the hand than the fingers. We're very autonomy focused, which is appropriate and right that we do, but it leads to challenges. So in recruitment, right, an individual decision to participate in research or not can affect whether or not other members of the family can participate. So for example, if you have an individual in front of you who you don't know what's going on, so you need other members of the family to participate, and one person who has, frankly, critical information that you need in order to understand the information of the person in front of you says, no, I won't participate, that's the end of the story. Like, that person can't enroll in the trial. For the purposes of informed consent. And how do we talk to families about this? I mean, should we be talking to each individual member of the family like we traditionally do in the context of research? Everybody has their own conversation to make their own decision. But there, again, are family implications of this information. And frankly, based on some research that we've done, we know that it's actually better when families talk about this with each other and when we get families to run through the scenarios together. At the level of return of results, so we're doing a lot more return of results, in particular of incidental or secondary findings. So we're doing whole genome sequencing, not just testing one gene. When you sequence the whole genome, you have all the genes. So we have a lot of information that we've started to give back to people, but oftentimes, in fact, we found a third of the time, about in the population we've looked at, family members make different choices about return of results. So you have information going back to one family member and another family member who absolutely doesn't want to know. So you have sort of an information imbalance there. And what happens if that person goes on Facebook and tells everybody? Now the person who opted out of knowing anything knows, and everybody else knows too. So it raises challenges for thinking through how to do this. And of course, concerns about privacy and confidentiality. Sometimes we'll find a variant that it's actually could be immediately and medically important for members of the family to know. For example, a high-risk variant for sudden cardiac death. And we might feel a duty to warn members of the family, but not everybody wants to know, again. So it raises challenges not only for the families themselves, but for the researchers and clinicians who are interacting with that family. This isn't a new problem at all, right? The sort of iconic incidental finding in genetic research is non-paternity. We have been dealing with that for decades and decades, and the policy has always been, if we find, and this we tell people at the time of consent, if we find non-paternity, we are not telling you. That has been the party line forever. There have been concerns about pedigree research, right? We draw these elaborate family trees, but elaborate family trees can be quite identifying. And so there's been, publication of partial pedigrees or shuffling of some of the members of that family to make it less identifying. And in the context of genomic research or testing, so for example, a study that Cindy will tell you a little bit about on Huntington's disease. When we first found the genes for Huntington's disease, they were mapped by linkage. So we only had markers, we didn't know where the actual gene was. So you needed to have family members. So we had a participant who wanted to be tested to know if that person was going to get Huntington's disease, but a person in their family would not get a sample, and so this person could not be tested. So again, we've been struggling with it for a long time, but there are new challenges, because we're way past markers, right? The first human genome cost $3.2 billion to sequence. That was 15 years ago. It's now $1,000, which is still expensive, but you can now sequence thousands of people as opposed to just individual genes. So we're doing a ton more sequencing, both in the context of clinical care, in research, and of course direct to consumer. So it's coming up, the scale of the problem has dramatically changed. I already mentioned incidental or secondary findings. We're starting to return a lot of information that we didn't used to have access to. And certainly patients didn't have access to. And a lot more of that is going back to a lot more people. Because in fact, most people want that information. If you give people a choice, if we find this other stuff, do you want to know? The vast majority of people say, yes, I want to. And of course, we have this. How many folks in the room have done 23andMe or Ancestry or another direct-to-consumer? That's lower than I usually see in rooms. Are people holding out on me? So lots of people are doing this, and not just individuals, right? People are giving 23andMe kits to their family members for Christmas, or Ancestry kits to their family members for Christmas. Entire families are doing this as projects. So there's a ton more of the large-scale genomic data being produced and returned, and of course, all of the issues that arise. I mean, headlines like this are coming out weekly now, right? Where someone who thought they completely understood their family structure goes, does 23andMe, and discovers that things aren't as they thought they were. And of course, concerns about law enforcement use of these repositories, et cetera. So the context is different. There's a lot more enrollment, consenting, and return of results happening in the context of genetic research. And the bold challenges now require us to deal with them again. And now I will
have the opportunity to spend a couple minutes today sharing with you the results of a couple of studies that we've done recently, really to look into how does this play out in research studies that involve enrollment and disclosure of results to families. And so the first one of these was from a study done 25 to 30 years ago that Deborah mentioned before on Huntington disease testing. So back when I was a PhD student, there was a very active study of adults with and at risk for Huntington's disease, where the Johns Hopkins Huntington's Disease Center offered pre-symptomatic genetic testing for HD as part of a clinical trial. There's a couple important things for you to know about HD in this context. First of all, it's autosomal dominant. That means if you inherit one copy of a broken gene, then you are at risk for developing the disease. The other important thing to know is this disease has very high penetrance. That means if you inherit the abnormal copy of the disease, you will develop the disease if you live long enough. And so in a study led by Deborah and her team, investigators here over the past couple of years examined the long-term consequences of both the pre-symptomatic genetic testing and the family decisions made at that time. So what did she learn? Really the team learned that overwhelmingly individuals considered their family, not just their own needs, when making the decision whether or not to pursue genetic testing. So here's a guy who enrolled who said, well, I need to do something for the family for Huntington's and get this going. And the sisters were both just adamant we were going to take this test. So that's him describing his decision making. The other thing we learned was that different decisions in the family to pursue testing or not had lasting impacts, both positive ones and negative ones, decades on. And I think that's really important for those of us to consider who are enrolling families in these genetics and genomics research studies. Another example that directly relates to the case we'll discuss today is the Centers for Mendelian Genomics. This is a wide-scale sequencing study that's ongoing here at Hopkins. It has been enrolling patients for the past 6 or 7 years. Looking out over the room, I know some of you are involved in this study. And the goal of this study is to contribute to the discovery of the genetic basis of most Mendelian phenotypes using next-generation sequencing and computational approaches. So something of an audacious goal, right? So because of this goal, many of us, including myself, are enrolling both children and adults with suspected Mendelian disease, but no molecular cause identified. So they're people that we think have a genetic condition, but we don't understand the genetic basis. Because of all the reasons Deborah just described, we enroll both affected and unaffected family members. And to date, we've sequenced now more than 7,000 individuals, and again from families ranging in size from 2 to, I think our biggest is 15 or 16 members. And the important thing to know is that when people are enrolling this study as part of the consent process, they have choices to make about whether or not to receive results. So they can choose to receive or not results related to the condition that led them or their family to enroll in the study. And they can also choose whether or not they want to receive results related to their risk for serious unrelated medical conditions. So those things we call secondary or incidental findings. In genetics in general, the choice of whether or not you want to receive secondary findings is optional. It's incumbent upon us to work with these families to really think about, well, how do patients make these choices? We had the opportunity, a group of genetic counselors, to put together a research study to ask the families we were enrolling how they made their decision whether or not to enroll and how they made their choices about whether or not to receive these secondary findings. And what we found out is that most participants paid really relatively little attention to this issue of secondary findings when they were enrolling because they really wanted to help research and they really wanted answers that were diagnostic answers about the cause of the condition. So here's one participant who said, well, you brought up a couple of good points and I hadn't really concentrated on too much, and probably everybody's got 5 to 7 things wrong with them, and how much of that do you really want to know? But I never really thought about that as much because I was more focused on getting the gene information for my disease, and that really captures a lot of what we heard from these families. As Deborah alluded to, as a next step in this research, we looked at the first 790 individuals enrolling in the Mendel study at Johns Hopkins. They were from 247 families. And we found that, indeed, as Deborah suggested, most people want results But more than 1 in 5, 22%, declined at least some type of result, with individuals of non-European ancestry more likely to decline results. And then further analysis we've done that's yet unpublished shows that, if you look across family members, about a third of the time, there were discordant choices made among family members. So imagine one sister said, yes, I want all results, and the other said, no, I don't want any. And you can imagine this makes things really complicated for families and investigators alike as we think about returning results. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to hand the mic over to my colleague Juli, who is going to introduce a fictional case of a family enrolling in a study much like the Mendel study. And the thing I want you to know is that this case is really almost exactly what we're presenting as the next step in our research. So we are interviewing Mendel study research participants to get their perspectives on the case we described. So look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you, Cindy. All right, so following up on what Cindy said is, having talked with these families that they mentioned in the interview project, we thought who best to ask, but these individuals who are currently enrolled about some of these issues that we're wrestling with about families. So we have, at this point, completed 26 interviews with individuals who've enrolled in the Mendel study to ask them about their experience enrolling, about who in their family communication about enrolling, if any, and then to present them with some illustrative case studies to get them to think about some of these issues. So I will start off by sharing with you the exact case study that we are presenting, and we're going to do 2 different scenarios. So let's start with the background. So bear with me, we created a family called the Dow family. And what's important about the Dow family is that Mr. and Mrs. Dow are both healthy, and they have 2 children, a 6-year-old daughter and an 8-year-old son. And the son is small for his size and has significant developmental delay. The daughter has healthy size and healthy development. Oh, sorry. The cause of their son's condition is currently unknown. Mr. Dow mentioned that he has some family history, he thinks, of some relatives that were sort of short stature and maybe some that had significant learning disabilities. So they enroll in a genomic study similar to the one that's the Mendel study that Cindy described. Mr. Dow invites his sister, who we're going to call the aunt, to join the study. She's from the side of the family that also has this history. So all the adults are healthy. The daughter is just the son that is affected. They all decide to participate in the sample, provide informed consent, and provide a blood sample. So as part of the consent process, the Dow members of the Dow family were also offered the choices for results similar to what was mentioned before. They could choose to receive primary findings, that is, to receive results related to the reason why they enrolled in the study, the cause of the son's condition. They could choose to receive secondary results, or any findings that are related to a medical condition that they're at significant risk for developing. They could choose to receive both types of results, or they could choose to receive no results. And I put little asterisks next to the individuals that are enrolled in the study and that have provided a blood sample. So in terms of the result choices, Mr. and Mrs. Dow chose to receive only findings that are related to an explanation for their son's condition. And because their children are minors, they made the same choices for their 2 children. So the immediate Dow family here only wants the results back that might explain the son's condition. Mr. Dow's sister, the aunt, she chooses to receive both types of findings. Okay, so we're going to stick with this family. We're going to stay with these exact result choices. They're not wavering, but we're going to now present 2 different scenarios in which what the researchers find differs. Okay, so let's ready to move on, and then we're going to start. Get your hands ready because we're going to start asking some questions and getting your feedback. So in this first case scenario, let's imagine that the researchers identify the cause of the boy's condition. It's a recessive condition. He has inherited 1 copy of a non-coding gene from his mother, 1 copy of a non-coding gene from his father. So my question to you is, who in the family should receive this result? So my first question is, who thinks the parents should be informed of this result show of hands? Who thinks the aunt should be notified of this result? Okay, so, and then I'll ask, who thinks the aunt should not be informed of this result? All right, so let's start. I'd like to hear first people's thoughts on just believing that only the parents should receive the result. someone who thought the aunt should not get this information? All right, a couple of new voices.
So in the diagram, it shows that the aunt doesn't have a mutation, correct? So I think that it would make sense not to tell her about it because it's not within her own DNA.
Okay. So I hear that because the aunt is not carrying a copy of the mutation, she should not be reported. Anybody else have a reason why?
Oh, just that we gave her the option to find out the information, and she opted to get the information. She wanted to know the primary results, right?
A negative result is a result.
Some can argue that in research studies, this is where it gets tricky. In research studies, they're not providing you typically an output of like a clinical test of all the results they check for and all of your sets. Typically in research, they'll send you back a positive finding. Those are where the impetus is to return results. We found something of importance. So the aunt is specifically left blank here because we don't know necessarily that she's not a carrier. We can figure out from the boy who's affected that both his parents have a mutation. But the aunt, she could have two normal copies, or she could be a carrier.
So you said this is a research study.
Correct.
Maybe I missed this. It came a little late. Was the aunt consented or only the parents consented?
They were all consented. So the parents provided consent on behalf of the two minor children, but each of them signed an individual informed consent asking whether they'd like to receive results related to the condition for which they joined the study. The aunt joined the study because of her nephew's condition.
So the aunt, sorry, so the aunt did sign consent?
Yes, she did.
She signed consent, she has the option then to get the data.
Okay, so there's someone who thinks she should get this.
So this is just a clarifying question.
Sure.
Did you not test the aunt?
These are good questions. These are all the sticky situations. So this is what researchers are wrestling with because we don't necessarily know that the aunt's been tested for everything or not. We know that we have information on the status of the son and that he's inheriting a recessive condition. We know his parents from the analysis are carriers.
So I think what's confusing here is that when I looked at these results, I thought what you were saying was she was double negative.
So she's double negative, so let me turn that question back, as True Counselor always does is reflect back. So does it matter, so what I'm hearing is she's entitled to the information only if she's a carrier?
No, I
Okay.
totally disagree. I mean,
Okay.
So I'm trying to just figure out what happened here. If I was the aunt, I signed a consent and I gave a sample, I contributed something in the expectation I would get something back.
Right,
So I would expect to get something back.
right.
I would like to know my status.
So these are really good points. So this is what we're wrestling with in even our interviews with folks who are in the study. So we're hearing a split. So some folks say, because the information is not directly relevant to her, it is private information that belongs to the son and his parents, and it's not theirs it's up to them to share it with the aunt. Others say, just like you said, the aunt contributed to research. She signed up to receive information about the cause of the condition for which she chose to enroll, and believe that she's entitled to the information. And here is the rub, because here's where individual privacy of your own personal result information is butting up with expectation and contributions to science as a familial endeavor.
I would also just clarify, there's a big difference between telling her, so this happens all the time, there's a big difference between telling her we're not going to share results versus telling her there's nothing to know. Because when I hear there's nothing to know from a doctor, that means I'm fine. Right? And that's very misleading if she's trying to make a decision about whether to have children.
Right.
So just saying, if there's nothing, you could act on that information and go get pregnant.
Right.
Versus hearing, we did not test your sample. Which is total, all I'm saying is that needs to be made very clear.
Right. Cindy, do you want to jump in here about knowing the status? Because Cindy is consenting folks with the study, and there is a question of sometimes we don't know if their sample was tested.
Yeah, so I wanted to press that a little bit further. Because certainly at the point of consent, you do not know in these situations whether you're going to need that sample of that aunt from a research perspective. And so I guess I'm curious to do a show of hands in the room. So to what extent do you think it matters whether or not the aunt's sample was tested, with whether or not she should receive the family result? So I guess a show of hands, who thinks that the aunt should only receive the family result, the cause of the thing in the boy, if her sample was actually tested? So a handful of you. Okay, so
my question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is there any way she could participate in the study without her sample being tested?
Absolutely. So the goal.
Can you repeat the question?
Sure, sorry. So this gentleman asked, well, is there any way the aunt could have actually joined the study and not have her sample used? And the answer to this question in real life is absolutely. So this is a research study. The goal is to identify the cause of all Mendelian conditions. And so the researchers don't know a priori whether or not they're going to need her sample. It depends on what they find.
So the consent you were doing was not to do testing, which I think is what maybe some of us thought, that meaning she was tested. It was just to enroll in a study where she potentially would need testing.
That's correct.
And then the other question I had was just that a scenario like this, a 6-year-old with global developmental delay would have clinically indicated genetic testing, starting with stiff and fragile X, and if it gets to a whole exome, that like there would be a trio sent. So typically, this child would be getting testing outside of a research setting.
Yeah, so let me just repeat that a little bit, just to make sure the whole audience can hear. So you had clarified that, okay, in real life, a child like this would have gone through clinical genetic testing, and in this current day and age, indeed, an exome would have been sent. And then what was the other piece that I'm missing?
The first part, I'm just clarifying that the aunt was not necessarily consenting for testing at the beginning.
Right, and indeed, the aunt at enrollment was consenting to allow her sample to be tested, but there was no promise that her sample would be tested. And so I think probably the important thing, you make a really good point, in 2019, that's exactly what would happen. For a family to enroll in this study, you had to be gene elusive based on currently available testing, and this study started enrolling back in 2012. So clinical exome was not widely available at that time. So that's, yes, the enrollment probably would have shifted, but at that time it was very different.
And just to add one thing onto what Cindy said, it's one of the questions we heard a lot in our earlier interviews with individuals who were enrolled in Mendel was questions of, I haven't heard anything back from the study, I'm not sure if my sample's been used or not. And in the research, when you contribute your sample to the study, with the, giving permission to be enrolled in the study, and if they learn something, if there's something to return, what your preference is for that. But that doesn't guarantee that your sample is included in the analysis or ultimately used in the study. So there's also sort of this black box. Did I not hear anything because my sample wasn't used? Did I not hear anything because I didn't find anything of importance to me? And that's another challenge of enrolling families in these studies, also facing the counselors that interface with this individual.
Seems to me the critical thing is the nature and content of the informed consent. If it's just a matter of, do you want to get results of the testing that we do, that's a whole different matter from walking through each one of these options and possibilities and offering the opportunity to accept the information back or to modify it or some variation on the theme. There might be 10 different options, which complicates the understanding of the consent, of course, but it seems to me that in advance you can plan some of these things to minimize the chances of confusion downstream.
Right, and just to follow up on that, what Deborah corrected me, is we heard a lot of that in some of these interviews where folks are not recalling what they chose. So in the recent interviews with the families, and even in the earlier one we just asked in general opinion about Mendel, we asked them, well, what do you remember the choices you made? And they'll say, I think knowing myself, I would have chose both. And it just reinforces what we heard earlier, that it speaks to the amount of information that needs to be covered in a consent process to begin with, and the amount of superseding concerns that these families may have. I mean, clinic, I have a child with a serious condition, we don't know what's causing, I just want to learn. It crowds out and things bump down the list. And so it piques our interest that people aren't remembering that these are, and we see from our early work with Huntington's population and talking to them 30 years later that this type of information can have long-term impacts, and we're not sure as many people are registering or having time to think through those issues at the front end of consent.
Yeah, I just wanted to say one thing about your question about, it could be 10 different options. Yes, but the data we have on this suggests that the vast majority of people want everything or nothing. So I think in the data you showed earlier, it was like 22% of our folks made more fine decisions than all or nothing.
Well, I would ask whether they understood clearly what everything or nothing meant.
Right, totally fair.
And the fact that we saw people who reported back, if I'd only realized what my decision was all about, I might have made another decision, which makes me ask, are there studies of choice regret in this field of discussion to know how many people regretted their choices once they realized that they weren't or were going to get the information, that they didn't know what it was going to be in advance?
The one study I know about this is by Amy McGuire, who had people, it was a hypothetical choice making, but they had people make choices, and then they randomized consent, and then, which is hard to get through an IRB, by the way. And then they had people make their selections, and then they debriefed them on what the study was about and gave them an option to change, and most people don't change. But we also, most people don't like to admit that they were wrong.
Yes.
Oh, no, I was just thinking we would move along to the question of, before we move on to the next case, we were curious what the audience thought of to what extent family dynamics or family requests should be incorporated when researchers were returning results. And whether or not, indeed, for those of you who thought that family, the aunt should receive results, whether or not the researchers should prioritize, should order the results. Does the nuclear family get results before the aunt? Does everybody get results at the same time? Really curious about your opinion on that, and then I'll put in the other question right now as well, just to get you thinking. If you can imagine a circumstance in which the researchers give the results back to the parents, who then say, oh, the holidays are coming, I don't want to deal with this with the family together, can you hold off giving it to the aunt, until after the holidays? And so those are two other questions. We're curious to hear what you think. Julie, I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, that's fine. I was going to say we're wrestling with family dynamics, and how do you think, so this comes to the broader question as well, is how do you think this should be returned? Family setting, priority given to parents of the child following up on family. Should researchers or consider family dynamics? So I see if I can go over
So I believe, certainly when I see patients, the primary responsibility is the primary individual. So if the patient's too young, in this case a child, it's the parents. Everyone else is extra. And I believe the first discussion should be with the primary family. Now, the only issue becomes if the aunt's there, then you're going to have some sense of, does the family want the aunt to be there at the same time? But that's not often the case. More often, I'll make up a number, 60% of the time, 80% of the time, it is still the primary family. We're there at the time of the visit. It should be the primary family.
Can I ask a clarifying question? Are you talking about clinical or research setting?
To some extent, they're related.
Yeah.
I don't see a big difference. Because,
Oh, that's interesting.
I mean, there's a big difference when it comes to consent. One's not consented, the other is. But you still have a primary responsibility. You're trying to figure out a disease. One case is a clinical paid for test versus research. You're still that primary role of taking care of a patient. I still think
That's interesting. It's what an interesting point or some comments we've heard in these interviews is a lot of people we've talked to say, well, I assume if they're all enrolling, the families talking and communicating. And that may be true at the front end, but we also know some of these studies go on for years and years, and information may be coming back much later. The dynamics in the family may have changed in the interim. So we posed a question, a follow-up question saying, say we have results to return to the family, we can't get in touch with Mr. and Mrs. Dow. They sort of dropped off the radar. They don't want to hear any more from the study for whatever reason. And the aunt starts calling the research team saying, hey, I joined the study 5 years ago. Did you guys ever find out anything from my contribution? Which brings us right back to
Not to belabor the point, but these can be anticipated and included in the informed consent. We give the results to the parents first in this situation. You will be informed, Aunt May, afterwards if you agree to be informed and so on and so forth. I think part of it is this content of the informed consent.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, but our consents are generally framed around the individual in front of us and not the family. Right, so I do think that there's a huge amount that can be taken care of in advance if we encourage people to have these conversations with their family members. But that is not sort of standard operating procedure in most studies. Well, that's an empirical claim. I don't actually have data that back that up, but my sense is.
And recently I worked for in a research lab that was enrolling families in a first home study that's been going on for 25 years. And all the charts I went through, I saw one chart in which there was a letter in which all the family members signed saying, you're allowed to talk to these relatives about my results. But everybody else, it was up for grabs. We did not know. You have to occasionally go around through. Families change, as you know.
Are you still considering that her results were negative in our discussion here? Like,
Does it matter what her result is? I guess is my question to you. How does that change?
And that's, yes, if the parents' results were negative, then the parents would have been told you have a negative result, right? That was their participation. Their result from participation is that their result is negative.
Well, they're a carrier of the mutation.
Obviously.
So they're healthy, but they are potentially at risk for having another child with this condition.
Right. So I guess what I'm saying is if the aunt's result from participation is negative, I guess why is that? Talk more about that.
Why?
Why are we obligated to, or why are we thinking that she might be obligated to know the result of this study?
Well, let's just
Her
say,
result.
right, so her negative. So let's just say she's calling the research study. I'm just going to throw a twist in and bear with me. But she's calling the research study because her daughter is pregnant. And on the ultrasound, the baby is showing it's small for its size. And they know that this is something going on in the family and they're concerned. Now, would the aunt like to know she's not? We could just see where things can evolve based on the information that was found or not found, and when do those responsibilities or decisions change the calculation, so to speak.
I think it depends partially on to go back to the consent, but if you take her sample under the premise that she's going to be notified of results and then don't notify her because her results are negative, then you took her sample under false pretenses. I don't think she's necessarily entitled to know the results of the testing of her brother or the rest of the family, but I think if you tell her, we're going to test your results and you'll get the results, and then don't do that, then you've taken her results on the false pretenses.
Well, we're actually saying we're not necessarily testing her. All we're saying is she's consenting to participate, so there's no...
She wasn't tested, but if she was tested, I think that she has a right to know what her results were.
Okay, we have one more scenario to do, so I don't know if your question can hold for the... Okay. So, erase what we have. So we have the same family now. Wipe the slate clean. This is now going to get another sticky. So this time the researchers in their research, they don't find an identified cause for the son's condition. What they do find is a mutation in a gene associated with a serious heart condition. This is known as long QT syndrome. And long QT syndrome can cause sudden, unexpected cardiac death in otherwise healthy people. So, children and adults can be affected, and there's treatment available and ways to mitigate your risk in terms of safe medications. So they identified long QT syndrome. So this is an autosomal dominant mutation. If you carry the mutation, you're at risk for long QT, which can affect adults and children, and the risk is unexpected sudden cardiac death in otherwise healthy people. There's treatment available that can mitigate your risk, safe medications to take, lists of activities to avoid. So this is what has been found. So they didn't find a cause for the boy's condition, but they identified the mutation in long QT in Mr. Dow, his sister, the aunt, and the healthy daughter. So these are all the individuals been identified through the research study of carrying this mutation. Now let's remember the result choices. The immediate family only wanted to learn results for the condition related to the condition for which they enrolled, explaining the boy's symptoms. The aunt chose to receive both those primary results and secondary results. Okay. So, who do you think should receive this result? I'll have a hand go up and somebody tell me who they think should get this information back about long QT syndrome. Anybody?
Everyone.
Yeah.
They all should have a responsibility to start detecting a new era of genomics, clinical research, find serious genes that were outside the realm of what we're studying, the responsibility.
I need to sit on top.
So I'm going to disagree and say just the hand.
And can you explain your?
So to some extent, it's about maintaining the trust of your study participants. She was the only one who wanted to know. She's the only one who consented to know. She's the only one who should know.
I see a head shaking down there. Where's the microphone?
I think that, as the gentleman was saying over there, I think the knowledge of a lethal disease trumps.
Yeah, no, I just think that everyone needs to be notified who carries the gene. And I think the knowledge of the gene trumps the need to know of a lethal disease trumps the original statement that they need to get the information.
So in genetic results, or in genetic research, and ethical research around genomics, there has always been this policy that people have a right not to know. And in fact, lots of people don't want to know. Right? So prior to a test for Huntington's disease being available, 75% of people who are at risk said they would take it if it was available. And since it's been available, it's always been below 20% of people who are at risk actually want to find out.
But I think this is different from Huntington's.
Okay? Why?
Because this is a potentially treatable disease and Huntington's
So this is potentially treatable, whereas Huntington's
is not.
Would your view change if it was not QT that was found, but another serious disease like Huntington's was found?
I think that would depend, but I think this is eminently treatable.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was going to say. I think that the presence of treatment changes the equation a lot. Whether that there's an intervention available is something that you should tell people. Like, I'm not sure that you should just tell them straight up what it is, but maybe you could say, you know, we found a potential returnable thing. Would you like to reevaluate your choice?
So that's a really hard conversation to have, right? Because who are you going to go up to them and say, okay, we found something that we felt it was important enough to violate your consent to tell you existed. Do you want to know?
Yeah.
That's going to be hard to say no to at that point.
And then who is it that tells you the research team, the person who got enrolled into you? This could be years later. Does it go to your doctor? I mean, at what point is someone, who decides it's enough that I need to trump their consent?
Just to go back though to the treatable versus non-treatable, that's a changing continuum. You use the example of Huntington.
Yeah.
We're on the verge now of a therapy that stops Huntington.
Yeah.
So antisense oligonucleotide therapy. So a year from now, when that's FDA approved, in a few years, it doesn't matter. Suddenly that becomes a very important data point. Where before you might say, maybe I'll get it from 60 or 70. Now, the treatment. Well, the treatment is great.
So should we not be giving people, in our consent choices, should we not be giving people the option not to know anymore for some subset of mutations?
Kind of what you're saying, I think, you know, with the consenting one, you should probably have, like, not necessarily a list of like, okay, we'll tell you better or not, but treatable versus non-treatable things. There has to be some way in the consent process. You can kind of bring that up to their attention and say, we can tell you about these treatable things. The gray area becomes just like we're getting into now, like what if something becomes treatable? How do we handle that information? But I think you can kind of handle treatable versus non-treatable disease that we know now in the consent process.
So That does happen sometimes. I mean, it depends, of course, on how the consent process goes and how it's actually explained. But the American College of Medical Genetics and Genomics issued this list a number of years ago now of reportable secondary findings that are supposed to be important, medically actionable results that ought to be returned. At first, they said without regard to patient preference, and there was a huge uproar about that.
Huge pushback.
So they stepped back from that a bit because of this issue of right not to know. There's still debate about what belongs on that list and what doesn't belong on that list. But even when we tell folks, you know, there are these ACMG 59 that are actionable, people still decline to receive those.
Yeah, I would defend that choice for a second, which is that I think we all have to keep in mind that we are in the medical community, and that to us, treatment is a really great thing. And that it's something that empowers us to do something and to feel agency. And that isn't always true for people outside, for patients. Just because something is treatable does not mean it will not change their life enormously and forever, and disrupt their life and create enormous anxiety. So, you know, just remembering our viewpoint here, that when we hear, oh, there's something that we can do, we want to do it. But that doesn't hold for people outside the medical community necessarily.
Right, and we've seen a lot of that play out in the Huntington's literature about folks in terms of there is no treatment currently for Huntington's disease, but people make multiple choices of not getting tested and have been satisfied with that, and also being tested and saying, I know there's no treatment available, but there are many things that I have used this information to do in terms of personal utility, planning families, planning jobs, planning how they want to live in their years and how they want to spend their money. So hinging on treatable has always been a sort of sketchy slope in genomics. And just the other thing to throw out to consider, though, is when we talk about letting folks know in research that you know what they may hear back, that also starts to imply and put the burden on the research endeavor of this duty to look for these things. This is supposed to be a research study, but the researchers are supposed to be using their resources and their time to try to figure out causes of disease. If we start putting a expectation and burden on them that they need to look for these 59, to let patients know who enroll in the research that look at these types of results or not those types of results, you can make an argument that that takes away resources from the future goal of the study, which is to try to find causes for this disease and then ultimately using that information to find treatments and cures. So once we start saying, try to cage like it's the right thing to do, or we should be, reporting all the negative results, when implementing that practically, that has also ethical consequences of, is this the best way to be spending resource dollars when, as an advocate, argue to say people should be contributing research to advance science. There's that end of the spectrum argument.
Sort of add on to that as well, that of course genetics is a rapidly evolving field, and once you've returned a result, then I think there's some degree of responsibility among all of us for the nuances of tracking if our interpretation of the pathogenicity of that variant changes over time. Is it now the onus of the research team now to return an update on that result? And so it becomes complex as time moves forward. One thing I wanted to take the opportunity to do, so when we were interviewing our participants, asking them this question of who should receive the results, and the basic answers people gave were everything, or that everyone should receive this result versus the and only. It was about a 1/3, 2/3 split, with opinions really closely held. And I think in this very different audience, I'd just be curious if you're willing to go a show of hands. So after our conversation, who thinks the researchers should return this long QT result to everybody at risk? So we've heard from a couple of those folks. Willing to give a show of hands?
So the results should go to everyone at risk regardless of
What box
consent
they
choice.
checked, yeah. All right. Who believes it should go to the and only?
That's a different split.
And who has some other solution to the problem?
Oh, I'd
Oh,
like to go
good.
to the other side.
All right.
Well, I don't have a solution to that, but my concern would be for the doctor, because the parents, as autonomous adults, are exerting their right not to know, but they're also making that decision for the daughter. So is there some mechanism whereby, when she turns 18, she's then, this is like super long term, but she's somehow given an opportunity to make the decision for herself at that point. She is the one, to me, in this situation, that's that's great, because everyone else is an adult, presumably it's been explained to them what these risks could be if they choose not to find out secondary results, but she does not get that choice that's made for her. So that's my concern with this whole situation.
Right, and that was echoed in many of the folks that we spoke to. We heard both sides of that, saying, you know, parents make decisions on behalf of the rights of their and interests of their children all the time. They can decide whether they're going to give them a vaccine. They can decide whether they're going to send them to private school or not going to let them look at a screen. So that's sort of the default of parents. We've heard that pushback, and we've also heard that they're actively declining something that could potentially save her life than knowing. And just to say, in terms of logistics of tracking, who knows how long this study will go on and the resources end, and then whose responsibility is to track her when she's 18 to give her this information. So there's what we want to do at times, and then there's the reality of what we can do, and these are all great challenges that the community is wrestling with. What is the duty to recontact? Who holds that duty? How do we pay for that effort to do that? So you guys are bringing up great stuff.
I think one other thing to consider is the burden of knowledge on the aunt, then if she's the only one who knows and how that could impact the family relationships, not telling the children who do not make their own decision, and years down the line put a death in the family that be blamed on the aunt if she didn't divulge this information to the family in respect to their autonomy initially.
Right.
Yeah, that's a great point, right? So now the aunt has this information, her niece and nephew don't. She doesn't necessarily know what their status is, right? Like, how does that affect the family dynamic? What does Thanksgiving look like in that scenario?
Does she have the onus, the responsibility to splatter this all over Facebook and tell her relatives, I got testing and I got this mutation and you guys can be at risk, you should think about it. So what is that, how does that play out?
I still want to hear the alternative solutions for that.
Please.
Yeah.
My thought is, I'll say the word paternalism and just let me reflect on it. But my point is, have you considered things like opt-out as a strategy as opposed to opting in? When you give the consent, our policy is to give results to everybody who participates in the study, blah, 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 with all kinds of caveats around it. Are you okay with that, or do you want to make a specific decision not to receive any results? As opposed to you want results to be given to you as an opt-in strategy. Turn it around and say opt-out. And would that make a difference, do you think?
I have no idea. That's an interesting empirical question, though.
So my question was regarding if the physician of the family was actually also participating on the research, if he will have like this obligation of giving information to at least to the daughter that is a minor in this case, just portraying the clinical versus research scenario.
That's a real challenge of conflicted roles and blurring lines. It could be one genetic counselor enrolling 5 members of the family. And does that burden lie with that person, and what is their responsibility? And we've heard the term contract. We got a lot of pushback from the interview saying, I see the consent as a contract, and if I'm telling you I don't want to know this, you could really undermine my trust and confidence in the information that you're calling me out of nowhere and asking me if I want to reevaluate. And then the other 5 other interviewees were just so struggling with the daughter issue particularly, and saying, this is really tough, maybe we should go around it, maybe we should ask them, or one suggestion was maybe we should have folks reevaluate their consent choices over time, sporadic, like every year. There's an update sent to the, your things are still being in the study, we're making some progress, please let us know if you want to make choices, These again are resource-heavy information, but these are some of the things that we're hearing being passed around on those.
And frankly, there were also people who said, I don't care what box I check, I trust my physician to make the best decision for me. So that was all the way at the other end. Right.
I would say that telling the aunt is the solution, because there is no way that aunt is going to keep quiet about that. And the rest of the family is going to find out too and get tested and get the information.
Right, and we heard that a lot, there's a lot of expectation that if they're all joining the study, that they're all talking. And what we've seen in some of our Huntington's data is just decisions to get tested or not has caused splits and alienation in families. So that we would hope, I've heard a lot of the interviews, we hope that the aunt would share this information. but that there's the rubber. Is she going to share? Is it up to her to be the whistleblower here? So these are all really challenging.
I think it's a very interesting conversation, but I think it's also very interesting that there were people who had tests done to them that never gave consent about anything, didn't know the results, and then if they participate in one of these kinds of tests, and you guys, and the results aren't known, it helps you fulfill a self-fulfilling prophecy. Johns Hopkins or whoever is withholding information from me, that could very well have saved my mother's life, or my dad's life, or whatever. So I just think it needs a whole lot more discussion when there are people who live through not having consent for anything, and live to tell a story about it. I think that has to be added to the equation as well.
Sure. There's one thing.
I was just going to say, great discussion, by the way. If we take research out of the equation, like say we sent it to GeneDx,
right?
They're not going to report back. If you check off, no, I don't want to know, if it's not related to this disease, they will not report back. Sometimes I actually wish that they would, because you get one that is actually borderline positive, but if you didn't put the correct words in the description of the child's disease, it's just not reported back. So just to let everyone know, in these situations, you check off no, no means no. That's it.
So I just want to make one comment. So what we're interested in is when we presented these scenarios to the interview, and remind you we have a small sample set of 26, several people commented and said, I think this is really helpful exercise to think through. I never considered, because there's other pressing applications, there's a lot of information being built up the consent process. So this is something I never thought about, and wow, I didn't think about this before. These are really tough dilemmas. So I think, as a general counselor by training, I think it's really helpful to have information up front, to people to think through. Because we say in a lot of consent forms, and I took a quick perusal on a lot of genetic consent forms recently, it says, information might have family implications. And that came back from potentially the whole non-paternity issue, but you might want to consider this, because there might be family implications. But I'm not sure people really, as we know from our earlier interviews, pay much heed to that. Family implications just mean, okay. But we can see, even just in the DTC context, on other family implications, but this might have family implications that I'm not sure people recognize when they want to join, they want to help science, they want to find the cause of their son's condition.
Has the decision about non-paternity changed since it's now widely available, people can learn paternity?
Well, that cat's out of the bag on a lot of these DTC tests, as we considered by headlines that we're seeing. And it's not even just non-maternity. It could be changing your identity. I always thought I was, you see the 23andMe ads on TV, I always pay attention to them. I always thought I was Scottish and having a kilt, and now I'm making meatballs because I realized my whole family, who are being Irish or Scottish, is now Italian. And that's always portrayed as a fun fact, and this could be very disconcerting to folks. In response to your question about non-paternity, the most recent issue of Genomics and Medicine, which is the Journal for the American College of Genetics and Genomics, this month's issue is non-paternity revisited. About we need to be thinking about this issue again, because before we just swept in the rug saying we're not going to let you know, it's not because we're doing a single gene test, it's not relevant to the interpretation. Sorting through genomic sequencing variants, it may very well be relevant to the interpretation that the genome, that we can't use the genome of a parent, it's not biologically related, it's not giving us informative interpretive value. So at what point, there's this new hedging thought piece about when we might have to rethink about revealing non-paternity in these very specific cases where it really can make us decide whether it's a brand new mutation or an inherited normal variant. Some of those decisions about, we saw something new, is this disease causing, well, if it's in the normal biological parent, it's probably a normal family variant, but if you don't have the normal parents to interpret that, it starts to get tough. So we thought non-paternity was something we could just put in a disclaimer, and because of technology and volume, it is back, and it's really back in the DTC market particularly.
Any other comments, questions, or solutions?
Please send us solutions.
This isn't really a solution, but kind of going with the first scenario, the question in my mind was, how do you define what sharing a result means? And so I think that that's something to think about too. Like, is it that you say, oh, we found this specific gene is associated with this specific thing and it's inherited in this way, and you're telling the aunt all of that? Or are you telling her, hey, we were able to figure it out, we didn't use your DNA to look at that, or we did, and we found you weren't a carrier, or whatever. It's like the specifics of how much you share feels relevant to me as well.
And what I'm hearing from the group and the suggestions, and some of the suggestions we've heard from our interviewees and just talking amongst ourselves, is there needs to be a lot of expectation setting up front, which a lot of these studies are out and in action, and the cat's out of the bag. There's lots of studies going on that are returning research results that gave 2 check boxes like that, and now that results are starting to trickle in, we're left with people who had those 2 concrete boxes to check and deal with what do we do now? Everything with genomics is let people know up front. What are we going to say? Under what conditions are we going to do it? We may or may not be testing your sample to be contributive. No, in some of our earlier interviews, no news from the study does not mean that we didn't use your sample. They just, they're doing this for research. There's no guarantee that information is coming out of it. So it's a real difficult challenge, but what's really makes us struggle as well too is we interview folks who were enrolled within the last year, and hardly anyone said, oh, I know what I chose. Almost all of them said, I think I chose both. So we can do a lot of upfront expectation setting, but how does that play out in reality, again, because of all these conflicting parameters, which makes us think about, are there other ways we can be consenting? This is to a broader consent issue in general. I mean, these are long consent forms. These people came to genetics clinic. They might be here for 5 hours. They traveled from out of state, and now we're going to go through a 9-page consent with them. They might just be done. So what are other ways that we can have some thought-provoking resources at times? One thought.
I've got a terrible option. If they say no, then you put the results in a folder, and then they'll hand it to them and say, if you change your mind,
It's
then go to a genetic counselor and talk to them about it.
It's like the OB that puts the gender of the baby and lifts the envelope and hands it to the parents and says, okay, you want to know.
That's a thing people do.
Yes.
One other thought is tell them that the results of the study will be put on a highly confidential, protected site on the internet, and here's the code for you to access the data if you want it. Now, I know you want to give a lot of personal information and explanation and all kinds of other things, but before they go to Google and find out, well, what does this mean for me? But that's one way you might be able to head this off.
I like the Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Really fun and interesting